Hello, team. Okay, I just got outside my little outside nap time studio. And I hope you're all doing well. I came back out to this piece and I realized that one of the things I was talking about yesterday happened to me here. And so I'm not quite sure if you can see this. I'm going to move the paper up to the camera just a little bit and kind of shift it back and forth in the light, and hopefully you'll be able to see it. Right here in this blue and in these yellows here, you can see I've got like a little bit of shine on there, and that's just like, that's gum arabic that couldn't make its way into the paper to bind the pigment down, and so it went up to the top as the water evaporates. You know, the binder is supposed to bind the pigment to the paper, and instead that area must be saturated, and so the pigment sits down, but the gum arabic comes up, right? Because it has nowhere else to go, because that area of the paper is full. So you get these little shiny bits, right? And we don't want that. So what we do want is to remove those. And this is a great opportunity to talk about lifting on purpose and re-wetting paper, even on a tester, maybe most importantly on a tester, because you don't care about this as much, right? This isn't precious. So I'm going to be using, I think, my wash brush, because it's just got a nice length to its bristles. Sometimes people like to use a little stubby brush. You know, you could use a shorter brush because you can kind of scrub back and forth, even though I've told you not to scrub, but just to reactivate. So I've got a little bit of water, and I just want to lift here on this yellow. So I'm just going to bring a little bit more water right over here to this pigment that we laid down. And I can see already it's been lifted. And I can let that dry just like that, or I can come in and I can remove a little bit as well. And I still like that pigment, so I've got a little bit of that here. So this is a really good example of how impermanent watercolor is. See how much I can lift that? Wow. Okay, you can even see what like brand of paper towels I have here. So I'm just going to even this out. This nice, that came up so much. But that's still good. Now I actually like these steps more, except the jump from here to here is so great. And I can fiddle with this if I would like to. So I can come back to my yellow, and this is a good opportunity to clean that yellow off, right? And I can put a little tiny bit of violet in that yellow. That's way too much. Way too much. Here, let's not be lazy. Okay, so when you're being lazy, sometimes you'll make work harder on yourself than it needs to be, and we don't need to make anything harder than it needs to be. So I'm just cleaning out my wells here because I left them with all of the paints from yesterday. So I'm just going to clean these out. And actually I really like those yellows, so it's hard for me to cover them up again. But I don't like this jump from this to here. So I am just going to make a half step there that's got some yellow. And then this is what had my little bit of violet in it. And I'm going to take a slight bit more. That's not a slight bit. Man, that violet is strong and yellow is weak. Yellow is weak. Violet is strong. Okay, there we go. That's much better. So now I can just drop this back in here. Oh, yes. Okay, so I like this progression much more. If you wanted to lay a little bit of pigment on there again, you could. I see this other little spot here in my blue where I've got a little bit of gum arabic built up, so I'm just going to take a little bit of my water here. And I was starting to talk to you about impermanence and how when you're working in watercolor, you're basically working with a medium that is never permanent, right? So it's going to dry up, right? It's going to dry lighter than you set it down, but also you can put water over it and you can move it around. You can move it around a day from now. You can move it around a week from now, a month from now, a year from now, 10 years from now. You could go back on those pieces from 500 years ago and and just remove, come back in there with water, move things around. I have dropped entire glasses of water on my pieces. I've worked on pieces for hours and spilled all sorts of things. You can imagine there's been some beers spilled on certain occasions. Maybe you're sitting next to somebody in class when we're actually in a class and we're not doing this in the comfort of our own homes. And somebody might flick a bunch of paint onto your piece on accident. You know, and with acrylic, if something were like that and your piece underneath was dry, you would just be able to clean that new paint off. But with watercolor, nothing is permanent. Nothing is permanent. It's just water that we are staining our paper with. So you need to be really careful about where you store your pieces, how you have your setup. If you have a tendency to be clumsy, just really thinking about where your water is and what's going to happen, but also knowing that having this ability, right, treating it as a gift of the medium, that you can always come back in with water and lift and change and reactivate your paper. So again, when people tell you it's, you know, so difficult, and sometimes people will be like, oh, but you know, you don't have an eraser, or you have to be so sure in your mark. Just remember that you have the gift, I'm going to call it a gift, the gift of water, right? Water puts the color on and it takes the color off. So here's the complementary colors that we made yesterday, and these will dry again. And look at how this is like pooling again. If you're not happy with pooling, you can take a dry brush, a brush that has no paint or anything on it, and you can lift this way as well, so I can pick up some of that pigment. I can also come back in with just the corner of a paper towel or a washcloth and just lift that up a little bit if you don't like that pooling that's happening. And part of that's happening because the rest of my paper is dry and I was just working on this one little area, and so imagine that, you know, there's just a little bit of water right there, and all water loves water, right? Water is hydrophilic. So it's gonna find its buddies there and make this little warping, this little ripple in there. We're gonna pick one color combo today, and we are gonna talk about, instead of just color intensity, right, bright versus dull, we're gonna add another element, and we're gonna start to talk about color value. So this is an assignment that I like to give to all of my students, no matter their age, because it talks about the breakdown of light. And I'm just going to show you a couple examples in watercolor. I have a whole bunch of them. But basically we're going to be looking at the 6 parts of light. I'm going to set this out to dry. And in our 6 parts of light, this one was done with red and green, and then I'm also adding a little bit of black to darken my red. So we're dealing, and actually a little bit of black to darken my green as well. So we're talking about how complementary colors affect each other's color intensity, right? When we set them side by side, how they affect each other's color intensity as well, to make them duller when we mix them, right? Like this red has a little bit of green mixed in with it, but then also adding black in if we're going to make our values using black, the same way we did in our color wheel, creating tints and shades. And we're gonna make these steps of values. So we're gonna talk about highlight right here, which is the lightest point that it's receiving the highest amount of light, and we're going to talk about placing our light source and where that highlight will happen. Then we move from our highlight into an area of light, which is receiving basically light, not as much light as our highlight, but really no percentage of shadow or very little. And then we're going to move into our shadow zone, start to make those values a little bit darker. And then within our shadow, we're going to identify our core shadow, which is the part of our shadow that is at the true core, right? It is the darkest part of the shadow area. and then we're gonna come back out on the other side of our sphere that's gonna be rounding away and reflecting the light from the table. We're like magicians today. We're setting up a perfect situation in which a beautiful sphere is sitting on a table. Maybe it's white and we're casting green light onto it, or it's a green sphere and we're getting that little bit of highlight right on there. But we're in full control of the lighting situation and the way that this is going to settle. This hardly ever happens so perfectly, right? The highlight, light, shadow, cast shadow, and reflected light shump on one sphere, because there's usually more than one light source in a room. The massive light source that is the sun, you know, could be bouncing off of certain walls or windows. It could be reflected off of a surface that's highly polished, or something like granite or steel or mirror that's bouncing light around and creating more light sources. So we hardly ever get this perfect situation, but for learning the breakdown of value, it's so important, just so that you have in your back pocket an idea of where highlights, lights, shadows, core shadows, reflected light, and then finally cast shadows come into relationship with one another. This cast shadow, right, is going to be determined by where we place our light source, and as that light source is coming down, where it blocks out the light, the sphere itself blocks out the light, and the cast shadow is cast down onto our table plane here and creates our cast shadow. It casts a shadow onto the ground, just like you cast a shadow down onto the ground. And then we're going to play with creating this drama in the background, this high contrast where we have something that's dark versus light, that's a dull red versus a bright green, you know, playing those off of each other. And I'm just going to kind of flip through these, and then I'll make at least some of these, I'm not sure about all of them, available to look at, just so you guys can see how much this assignment varies for me. So this is green sphere, red background. This is red sphere, green background. This guy's funny. I was making some little dots up here showing somebody how prickly pear spines happen in a polka dot pattern, so I know that that's why I have this little bit of polka dot in my background. And we're going to use this background too to kind of play with some different brush strokes, not just dealing with value and light and shade. So we'll be talking about a lot of things today. This one's not labeled, which you guys can see. Here's a yellow and violet light source over here on the left this time. And I've come back in with some gel pen, and I was showing a student how one of the things that I really enjoy about watercolor is how when it dries down, I can come back in and identify those points of evaporation, you know, that created these new edges that I didn't necessarily create with my brush, and I can sort of outline them and bring them forward. And I draw all over my work all the time with gel pen and felt tip marker. So there is yellow and violet. Oh, and then here's, I'm always choosing orange and blue. So there's just a wild collection of orange and blues. I remember in this class, I told everybody to just try out as many marks as possible in their background, and I was just kind of going crazy, creating some cross hatching over here with the orange and blue, and these kind of big sort of radial spikes coming out of my ball, and over here trying to really pump up the glassy reflected light, letting that orange bleed into my blue. This area here is like wet on wet, so both the orange and the blue were wet at the same time, and then the orange just flooded into the blue. Here I've got another one. This one's really like subdued, and I don't know, this one seems really like classic. I have a lot more blue mixed in with my orange here, so I must have been talking about making dark, dull colors and really pushing some blues into my oranges as well. Whereas you can see this one like side by side here. Can we make these side by side? I guess if I kind of flip them this way. How bright this still is, even if it's going down into darker colors. Remember yesterday I was talking about how you can have dark, dull colors and light, dull colors, and you can have dark, bright colors and light, bright colors, and really solidifying for yourself the idea of a complementary color affecting color intensity, brightness and dullness, and then pushing your values light and dark to create color value. Values or relationship between light and dark. Okay, so there's all these. Here's even more orange and blue ones. My goodness, I will not put all of these. This guy doesn't have a background, but he has a lot more marks. I remember I had a student who was like really asking me to push drawn marks with my brush in here. And so if you can see, I'm really loading up orange and blue down in here, and then I'm pulling a little bit of orange out into my background as well. And this is maybe like the most drawn of all of the examples, and you can see really clearly the highlight, light, shadow, core shadow, reflected light, and cast shadow. And this right here, this core shadow, is going to be the thing we probably end up talking about the most, because I feel like it's the thing that causes the most amount of problems. These are very much assignments and practice. So you can see I have pencils showing through here. If you don't like the look of pencil, you can use a watercolor pencil to lay out your circle. If you are a confident circle maker, you don't have to use pencil at all, and you can just grab you know, your paintbrush and go for it. So we have been using the Arches hot pressed watercolor, and I thought maybe today, just to show you like what the grain looks like and what the actual difference in cold press versus hot press is, just taking this little bit of cold press here. So again, I'm going to set it down, and then I'm going to tape down. And remember, with your tape, you want to take a piece of tape that's the size that you need it, then pull it with your thumbs, and you just want to be part on your paper, part off your paper. It could be up to a ½ inch. I mean, I guess if you had big thick tape, it could be a full inch in, but that seems like a waste of paper. And I always like to do top and bottom first, making sure my paper is nice and flat as I'm taping it down, and then taking my sides and taping those off as well. And today, if we're dry enough, and maybe I'll just force it even if it's not dry enough, at the end of the demonstration I'll show you how nice it is to remove tape and get that beautiful edge, that white edge of your paper, so that you get color all the way to the sides. If you have a nice roll of tape, you can just use this as your circle. So I am just going to, I want to work more this direction. I'm trying to make it so that you guys can see all of my work at all times, and I realize that being right-handed and reaching across my paper to the left side is occasionally problematic. So I just laid a circle down. I didn't put it right in the middle. I put it just slightly over to the right. You could put yours slightly over to the left. I have it approximately where my thirds meet. So if you've never learned about the rule of thirds, if you separate your paper into 3 even sections horizontally and 3 even sections vertically, we love those intersection points of those 2 lines as focal points. So this is kind of like where my core shadow is going to be in here, and so it's going to hit kind of on those imaginary lines that are created by the rule of thirds. And then I'm going to make a real line for my table, and I'm just going to use a ruler here, and I'm going to come up so that my table is about 1/3 of the way through my sphere, and I'm just going to make a line here and a line here, and now I have a table. And then I'm going to just draw in my light source because I want people to know where my light is coming from. This is not the kind of piece necessarily that gets hung up on the wall. This is one that goes into your file folder as something that you've done. And we see here that our light source, our little sun, is cutting over here, and it's creating light that's touching the sphere, and it's making this most connected point right in here. So that's going to be our highlight. Then we're going to move out into our light area, further out into our shadow area, create our core shadow, allow our reflected light to really sing through, and then we'll mix some of this color down into our table as well, so that we get some reflected color and reflected light bouncing off of each other. And then we're also going to create this nice little cast shadow. And I'm going to say the sun is cutting down here, and that right in through here, my sphere is blocking out the light. And my cast shadow is going to be a nice ellipse, and this one's going to go right off the paper. And it's not going to be a solid black, right? I always tell my students that even a cast shadow is allowing light to pass through it. You can change the time of day, right? And your light sources, we know that as the sun gets lower on the horizon, we get those really stretched out shadows. And if you picked to have your light source right above your sphere, you'd get this little shump shump cast shadow just on either side, right underneath your sphere. If turning circles into spheres is something new for you and you have not done this in drawing or painting, this is a fun thing to practice whenever you are able to just sort of doodle, you know, working on creating these types of value transitions, because really all three-dimensional complex objects still have these breakdowns, this 6-part value breakdown. And so if you get really good at just sort of like creating them within your circle and turning your circle into a sphere, then you'll be able to apply that to a shell or an orange or a human face or a beautiful tree or whatever it may be. So this sort of breakdown of light and shadow is gonna really help you to see how light falls on three-dimensional objects. And I have so many blue and orange ones, so let's do the yellow one. Yeah? Since we were having so much trouble, we'll just make an even bigger challenge for ourselves. So I'm gonna pick up, here I have my good brush. It's a big number 8, it's real soppy, and it can hold a lot of water. And so I'm actually gonna just take a little bit of yellow and bring it over to my palette. And really, let's clean some of these out, because I'm not gonna need all this color from yesterday. We're not gonna touch orange and red and green. We're just gonna do our yellow and violet. And there's such intense colors on this set, so I think I'm happy with that choice. I'm just gonna pick this up and give myself a couple more little wells to work with here. If you are close to your sink, you can just get up or pause this video and walk away and clean your palette and come back. Okay. If you don't have a big, nice soppy brush, like an 8 or a 10, you can go ahead and grab a 6, right? This is my 6 here, this Sablette. This will work perfectly as well. If you're like, Koryn, all I have in my arsenal today is a flat brush will work just as good. You know, don't ever stop working because you feel like you don't have the right brush. You can do it. Okay, I'm just gonna take some water and I'm gonna put it down and I'm gonna run this line around, and I'm just gonna leave that little area that I'm calling the highlight, that is the area that's receiving the most amount of light. I'm gonna leave it the white of my paper. And do you see how I'm making all of my marks in a circular fashion? So really allowing the circle to determine the direction of my mark making. And then I'm going to pick up a little bit of yellow, and I already have some over here in a well. And I know I can set down a really heavy yellow over here because I'm going to go over it. And if I set that down, I can kind of pull it through. And so that first place that you set down value is going to have the heaviest value. And then I'm just barely touching my paper. Your highlight is never at the very edge of your sphere, Because if you think about a sphere as being something that is basically one surface, right? One continuous surface. The closest part to the light source is never actually out here on the edge, right? That's actually already moving away from the light source. So we just bring it in just slightly, and then I'm gonna leave that kind of like just barely. I'm just gonna bring a little tiny bit of water in. Do you see how thin this yellow is that I'm working with? It's like what I would call a 15%, 10 to 15% yellow, so that if this were a black and white image, this would just be the littlest bit of value in through there. Remember how we talked about like a true yellow is more like a 25%, and we're gonna push it a little bit darker. So you can do a couple different things here, but what I'm gonna do is I'm going to take my yellow, and we already have a little bit with some violet mixed into it. And I'm just going to make a slight shadow area. So you can take yellow with a little bit of violet, or you can take yellow with a little tiny bit of black. And they're going to do really similar things because remember, this black has a whole bunch of blue in it. So if you see that black, it's going to be a really cold black. And I can take this and just show you over here. They're really similar colors, right? One goes a little bit more green. I had quite a bit of black on that brush. Let's bring some yellow back in through here. There we go. So you can see right there, I dropped one into the other. That let's show you on a piece of paper. So right here, if you take this yellow, right? Do you guys remember yesterday when I was talking about how big this brush is and how much water it can carry? Oh my gosh, it's so huge. And then this one, it got a little bit of black in it, so I want to make it pure again. So I'm just going to take a little bit of yellow, and then I'm going to take a tiny bit of this color that we already had that's got a little, or I can just take a little bit of violet by itself. Here's a little bit of violet, mix that in with my yellow, right? So that's just like toning it down just slightly. You guys can see how close these are, right? So one of those is adding violet, and one of those is adding black, and that's because our black is so cold, right? So I'm just gonna take this darker yellow, and I'm gonna drop it into basically my core shadow right here. And what I'm looking at in a core shadow is this like crescent moon shape, right? Right through here, that is the place that's furthest away from the light source before we come back to the reflected light. So you don't want to make a stripe that goes shump diagonally right across your sphere. You want to always roll with those marks, you know, roll with the idea of this being a round object, and you are creating that sphere through here, that core shadow. Oh yeah, that's great. So right in here, and I'm going to push it a little bit darker as well. So we just sent it one step darker, and that's already got a nice range of value in there. We have that highlight, which is the true white of our paper saved out, and then this area that was mostly water with just a little bit of pigment, and see how that like gradually just fades into the yellow that we laid down. And now I can make a slightly darker yellow. I'll take this one that we already had from earlier, which is yellow with a little bit of violet mixed into it, right? And I'm just gonna set it up right in here, and look at how all my marks are going along with my sphere. And again, if you're getting pooling and you don't like it, you can back up a bit, grab your paper towel, lift in some certain areas. I'm gonna go super heavy so you guys can see that even in these heavy values where it feels like you're making big jumps, the water's just gonna pull that in, move it around. I don't like that little guy jumping out there. So I'm gonna take a paper towel, and I'm just gonna pull that little bit back out. So I'm gonna work from this area out. And you can see here I can use my paper towel as a stamp too if I need to kind of clean up some places. You can also do this in very patient passes in which you let your entire shadow dry and then you add in a core shadow, but we're gonna kind of jump around, and I just want you to at least have this set up where it goes gradually from light, right, your highlight into your light, into your shadow, seeping into a core shadow, and then we're gonna get some reflected light right here along the back. And I'm gonna lift out this bright yellow that's coming to my edge. And I'm just gonna get, oh, I picked up my flat brush. I'm just gonna get a little bit more of this darker, and I'm gonna get some of this water out of my brush too. Got so much water in my brush. The more water you have on your brush, right, the more your color is gonna lift. So if I want that saturated color to stay a little bit more, I gotta remove a little bit of my water. And I'm just using this out here. I'm gonna take a little bit of water and I'm gonna soften this transition, just moving out where I had stamped with my paper towel and I didn't love it. And if ever there's an edge that you just don't like that much, you can come back in there and shift it. Okay, so I think I'm pretty happy with this. Just putting a little bit more water in here, getting to that true highlight. There we go, that's gonna dry nicely. And if you're like, I didn't save out that true highlight, right? Don't worry, okay? So here, I will get this wet so you can see, right? And that'll make a nice gradual transition. The amount of water and color that's there is so little, you're gonna be just fine. And you can also, if you got it all the way wet and you're like, no, I do still want it, remember you can just lift back out here, and I'm just dabbing as I come around the edge. Boop, boop. And now I'm being nitpicky, so I'm just gonna make one more little mark right here, and then I'm gonna walk away from this and we're gonna work on some background and some cast shadow. So let's make a really nice violet cast shadow that's got a little bit of yellow in it. So I'm gonna pick up some of the other little yellows that we had here. Ooh, there's a good violet yellow mix. And I'm just gonna take a tiny bit here and run it along the edge without actually touching any of my wet paint at this moment. Maybe I should do a really messy version of this as well. And I'm just gonna kind of make that fence again like we did when we were making tints and shades. And I'm gonna pull this all the way over. And I'm just gonna come back in with a little bit of water and make that nice gradual transition as we're running that cast shadow away from our sphere. And look, I got a little bit of yellow in here, and I'm not mad. I might sneak a little bit of this through on purpose now. We're gonna make a little, like, nice light violet to go around our background as well. We're gonna jump over to our true background though and make a dark violet to begin with, and then we're gonna come up here and lay down a lighter one. And it's funny, I never put my cast shadow in before I put in this baseline color, but I did it this time, so I'll show you how we can work with that. All of our marks on our table are going to be horizontal. They're going to go left to right so that our table really sits down. And then all of our marks in our background are going to be vertical, or like that one that I showed you guys that's like crazy radial, right, coming away from the sphere. But if we make vertical marks out through here, coming up, right, we're gonna get this really nice sense of it being tall in our background, and we're also gonna make it nice and dark back there so that against this really like bright light yellow, it's gonna pop. We're gonna make this side lighter, so I'm just putting a little bit of water out here, just getting it ready. I'm basically just prepping my paper. Remember, like you're washing your hair, you're getting your hair wet, getting ready to put that shampoo on, which is happening so much less than it used to, right? Although I did wash my hair yesterday, so I'm feeling pretty good about that. I'm gonna take my violet, I'm gonna bring it over here into a well, and then I'm just gonna take a little bit of black mixed in, right, so that I'm getting this nice dark, yeah, really nice and dark value. And I want you guys just to see, if I lay this in here and then I pull it up, I've switched to my flat brush right now, but you can use any brush. Your flat brush is just such a nice brush for making washes. And I'm pulling away, away, away from my sphere. If you've only got a couple of minutes to work at a time, you know, so that your practice is like 20 minutes here and 20 minutes there, if you work until the point that your sphere is like filled in with value, then you can walk away and it'll be totally dry when you come back to it, maybe later today or tomorrow. And then you can lay in your background and you don't have to be as careful as I am being right now to make sure that these two don't run into each other. And you can see I've left this little sort of halo there, and as it dries I'm gonna come back in and I think fill in that halo, because I like when the two colors do actually touch. I'm just gonna keep coming through, and as I let those, you know, vertical washes do their thing here, these brush strokes, I bet I can get in pretty darn close to our sphere now as I can see it drying. I am working outside in the Arizona heat. If you are in a wet area where there's much more humidity than Arizona in May, you may need a blow dryer close by if you're trying to do quick work. My only real suggestion to you, if you're going to use that blow dryer, is just don't move your paint around a bunch with it. You know, you're not using it to like blow paint from one side of the paper to the other. You're just using it to dry your paint. And you can see here, I'm not super happy with those marks that are right there. So I'm just going to take the edge of my flat brush and I'm holding it vertically to my paper so that it's perpendicular to my paper. And I'm just going to touch those bristles down onto my paper and I'm going to run them around the edge of my sphere here. Just moving some of this dark in here. Flat brush is an amazing thing. You guys can see here, I'm going to make some even darker marks, so I'm mixing even more black in with my violet here. If I want to make like some deep sort of stripes in here, you get this big thick mark, which is the width of your brush, right? This nice half-inch mark, or inch if you have an inch wash brush. That's wonderful, flat brush. And then you have this nice, lovely, controlled, thin mark off of the edge here. This is how I make a lot of my hatch marks as well. So you can play with loading up some marks out here. You know, I would tell you to have as much fun with this as you would like. I've got a little bit of violet seeping into my yellow over here. I'm just going to kind of put the brakes on that. And you can see there as I'm lifting, if you want to lift out from your light source, like if you want it to be more dramatic as it comes down onto your sphere. Dun, 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 dun. You can make this really nice dark on either side, right? To really cut your light source over. That can be really fun. Just to like load that up in through there. And I can do the same on the other side if I want to as well. Make it a little bit more violet. I can cut that back in here, and now all of a sudden I have this big light like coming down onto my sphere. My goodness, that is a dramatic light source. Okay, I'm gonna make a nice light value down here, and I'm gonna work it left to right. And it's gonna be like a really, really light violet that I don't think is gonna have really any yellow. I have a little bit maybe in here, so let's just see if that even affects it at all. I mostly just want the water to affect it. So I'm gonna take a bunch of water and make this really nice light value, and I can test it here. Is that light enough? Yeah, that's probably light enough. I can run this, just this little light value all the way through here. I really only have to be careful somewhere in here next to near my cast shadow, and then back here. I want my color in the foreground to be more saturated, and then I can just let this kind of fade away. Fade away. You're always going to try and leave a little bit of the white of your paper, no matter what you're working in, because once you lose all those whites, you're just sort of in trouble, right? You want that beautiful flooding that can still happen. Oh yeah. All right, this is getting silly up here, but that's okay. We're having light source fun. And this is just like really stale. So I'm gonna bring a little bit of that yellow down into here. I'm gonna pull like a little bit down into my shadow and let it do its thing down here. And I'm gonna pull a little bit of violet up into my sphere as well. So I'm just pulling a little bit of violet into my core shadow here. I'm gonna make it a little bit more apparent. And I'm just keeping those circular movements. Now I've switched to my flat brush, right? And now I have these flat brush marks over this, which are a little bit more drawn in this moment, where I'm making more like linear marks to make my sphere nice and fun. Maybe I want just the tiniest bit more yellow-violet combo in there. Boop. Drop it in, push that core shadow. Let that reflected light just sort of sing in there. You can run a wet brush with just a little bit of water along the edge if you'd like. If you don't like this harsh edge, you can soften that up as you come through there. Maybe I want to put like some really crazy purple marks in my background just to get some more dynamic marks back there. I love getting something that's like so dark next to my yellow, just to really make something pop forward and reinforce that lighting source, right? Where is that light source coming from? Maybe I'm gonna drop my brush down and kind of roll it around, kind of make some marks with this guy that are a different mark than I've been making, but still kind of vertical coming up here. You can see in here all of my hatch marks have kind of disappeared. That's okay. I love this when a little bit floods in there, right? And we can let some of this be a little bit darker because this whole side of the table is in shadow. So I can just pull some of that through. Maybe even pull some of this dark up here into the foreground. Do we want to do that? I don't know. Let's just sneak a little tiny bit of it over onto this side and just make that table line kind of carry on throughout there. What was that voice I was just slipping into? I'm not quite sure. I was getting gravelly. Gravelly. Okay. Boom. Yeah? Okay. I like this guy. It's gonna have some weird edges. If you know before something's completely dried down that it's gonna have some weird edges and you're not so sure that you want those to happen, just take a little bit of water. Just run it along the edge. The answer is always water. It's always water. You either have too much water or too little water. And if you come in from the side and you lay your water down here and then you just run your brush out and through, that should dry down pretty nicely. Yeah, we got a little bit of yellow down here. I feel like this side is lacking. I could pull a little bit more yellow through here if I wanted to, just to like bring a little bit of this sphere down into here and see some of that joy of watercolor where just like a little bit of two colors running together does something so special, right? That's what I was starting to talk about and how I really love that there's this mark that's out of control, right? That's gonna do its own thing. And I think that we're in a pretty good place. I think this is gonna dry pretty nicely. So I am going to go ahead and finish up here. I'm gonna let this dry. I'm gonna take a photograph of this. I'm gonna pick a couple of the complementary colors, right? Like this orange and blue one if you decided to work in orange and blue. This one's so dramatic. Let's see this other yellow sphere. They're pretty similar, right? Maybe the same person made these. My goodness, I see now that my cast shadow could be slightly darker. I'm gonna come in here and just like take a little bit of violet that's not so dark, but it also not a very big amount of water on my brush, so I have a more saturated violet, right? It's not diluted as much. I'm just gonna push right here where the cast shadow meets the object because that's where it's always gonna be the darkest, and I'm gonna pull it away. There we go. There we go. I like that cast shadow more. Feels more real. Okay. If you do this, I would love to see it. I always like seeing these little spheres because it is both easy and difficult. And sometimes it goes so horribly wrong that you're just like, nope, scrapping that, starting a new one. And if you feel that way, just go ahead and do it. Hopefully you have enough paper in your pack. And hopefully you can also see using the cold press that we're getting a lot more texture in here. Let me just move this out of the way so that you guys can see it a little bit more, right, close up in here. So hopefully you can see the texture within that paper, totally different than the hot press that we were using before. All right, thank you so much for your time, and I'm really looking forward to our next adventure because we're going to be playing with all the fun stuff, different mark making systems, rubbing alcohol, salt, saran wrap, sponges, cardboard, just looking at the versatility of our marks within the watercolor. So looking forward to that, and if you did a sphere, I want to see it. Okay, have a good one. Take care. Bye.